I unlocked the door after a 10-hour shift and said, "Hey, I'm home," expecting his voice to answer. Silence met me instead. The living room was dark except for the glow of the laptop on the couch. I frowned and said, "Evan?" No reply. My shoes came off slowly. Something felt wrong, but I told myself I was tired and dramatic. I stepped closer and saw tabs open. Porn. I sighed and muttered, "Really?" It didn't hurt at first. We had talked about it before. I was about to close the laptop when one search caught my eye. I whispered, "What is that?" The words didn't feel like they belonged in our home. My heart started racing, loud in my ears. I sat down hard and stared at the screen. "Please don't be what I think this is," I said, like saying it out loud could change the truth. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I clicked. My stomach dropped. I laughed once, sharp and broken, and said, "No. No, no, no." The room felt smaller. I suddenly felt too awake. Evan stumbled out of the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. "Hey, babe," he said. "You're home early." I looked at him and said, "What is this?" I turned the laptop so he could see. His smile faded. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "You're overthinking." I shook my head and said, "Don't do that. Not right now." He sighed and sat beside me. "It's just stuff I look at," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." I said, "It means something to me." My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. He shrugged and said, "It's not cheating." That word burned. I stood up and said, "You don't get to decide that alone." I paced and said, "We've been together 5 years. 5. He said, "I know." I laughed again and said, "You took my virginity, Evan. I trusted you with everything." He rubbed his face and said, "That's not fair." I stopped and said, "What's not fair is feeling stupid in my own house." He reached for me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said. "Just tell me the truth." He hesitated, and that pause told me more than words. My chest tightened. I thought about all the times I ignored little things. Late nights. Hidden screens. Excuses. I had called it love. I sat down again and pressed my palms together. "I need your phone," I said. He froze. "Why?" he asked. I looked up and said, "Because if I don't look now, I'll never sleep again." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Finally," he said, "you're going to take this the wrong way." I held out my hand. "Give it to me," I said. My voice was calm, and that scared me. He placed the phone in my palm like it weighed too much. The screen was warm. I stared at it and thought, this is the moment. I thought about who I was before him, and who I became with him. I looked at Evan and said, "I don't feel safe anymore." He whispered, "Lena, please." I unlocked the phone. My thumb hovered, shaking. I already knew something was ending. As the screen lit up my face, I thought, nothing will ever be the same again. I sat on the couch with Evan's phone in my hands and said, "I'm just going to look." My voice shook. He laughed and said, "You're being dramatic." I unlocked it anyway. The screen felt too bright. My chest burned as I opened his messages. I whispered, "Oh my God," and then again, "Oh my God," because my brain couldn't find anything else. I scrolled slowly, like I was walking into fire. Names I didn't recognize filled the screen. One message read, "Are you available tonight?" I said, "Who is this?" Evan leaned over and said, "It's spam." I clicked the thread. Pictures loaded. My hands started shaking. "This isn't spam," I said. He shrugged and said, "It's not real." I swallowed and said, "You paid her." He laughed and said, "So what?" That laugh cracked something inside me. "So what?" I repeated. I was asleep in our bed. He waved his hand and said, "You're overreacting." I felt heat rise in my face. Was I ever enough? I asked, not sure if I wanted an answer. I kept scrolling. Escort sites. Emails. Payment confirmations. I said, how long? He slurred, it's just a fantasy. I said, a fantasy you pay for? He nodded and said, it's harmless. I looked at him and said, then why hide it? He stared at the floor and said nothing. I stood up and said, you did this while I was sleeping next to you. He laughed again, louder this time, and said, relax. That word made my stomach twist. Don't tell me to relax, I said. You don't get to say that. He rolled his eyes and said, you're acting crazy. I opened another app and froze. Why do you have pictures of yourself? I asked. He said, so what? I scrolled and said, you sent these to other women. He said, it's just online. I felt my chest tighten. I gave you my body, I said. All of it. He shrugged and said, you're making this bigger than it is. I dropped onto the chair and pressed my fingers into my temples. I can't breathe, I said. He sighed and said, you're fine. I laughed, broken and sharp, and said, I'm not fine. I scrolled again and whispered, OnlyFans. He said, everyone uses that. I said, everyone doesn't hide it from their girlfriend. I found old photos. My throat closed. Why do you still have these? I asked. He squinted at the screen and said, I forgot. I said, you didn't forget. He stood and said, you're twisting things. I looked up and said, you're lying. He shook his head and said, you want me to be the bad guy. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept going. Email after email. Different names. Different cities. I said, how many? He said, I don't know. I whispered, that's worse. My chest burned like I was swallowing glass. I feel disgusting, I said. He replied, that's on you. I stared at him and said, do you hear yourself? He smirked and said, you're insecure. That word landed hard. You made me this way, I said. He laughed and said, no one forced you. I hugged myself and felt very small. Later, he sobered up. His voice changed. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said softly. I said, but you did. He sat beside me and said, I never met anyone. I looked at the phone and said, you tried. He said, it was just messages. I asked, do you think that helps? He grabbed my hand and said, I love you. I pulled away and said, love doesn't look like this. He said, it was a mistake. I shook my head and said, it was a pattern. Silence filled the room. My heart felt bruised. He paced and said, you're blowing this up. I said, I'm drowning and you're annoyed. He ran a hand through his hair and said, I didn't touch anyone. I replied, you reached for them. He scoffed and said, it's not the same. I asked, how would you feel if I did this? He went quiet. I waited and said, answer me. He shrugged and said, that's different. I laughed and said, because it's me. I pointed at the phone and said, you chose strangers. He snapped, it wasn't about choosing. I said, everything is a choice. He looked tired and said, I needed an escape. I asked, from what? He said, stress. I replied, so you escaped from me. He said, don't twist my words. I said, then explain them. He rubbed his eyes and said, I hate myself sometimes. I said, so do I right now. He stepped closer and said, I'll delete everything. I asked, why now? He said, because you're upset. I nodded and said, not because it's wrong. He didn't answer. The silence felt like an answer. I said, I trusted you in the dark. He whispered, I'm sorry. I said, sorry doesn't rewind nights. He said, I was drunk. I replied, you were sober enough to pay. He clenched his jaw. I felt my throat tighten and said, I don't recognize myself. He said, you're still you. I answered, I feel replaced. He reached out again and said, please don't leave. I said, I don't know how to stay. My voice broke. He said, we can fix this. I asked, can you fix what I saw? He shook his head. I nodded and said, then stop promising. I looked at the phone one last time and whispered, I wish I never touched this. I stood there shaking, knowing I could not unsee anything. My chest ached, my ears rang, and I realized denial was easier before truth arrived, because now staying hurt more than whatever leaving might become for me now. Evan stood in the doorway holding roses and a small box of chocolates and said, I brought these for you. I looked at them and felt nothing. I said, put them down. He hesitated. You don't like roses now? I shrugged and said, you only buy them when you mess up. That made him flinch. He set them on the table and said, I'm trying. I crossed my arms and said, trying would have been not doing it. He sighed and said, why do you always twist things? I answered, why do you always minimize them? My voice stayed calm, and I saw fear in his eyes. My silence scared him more than yelling ever did. He said, say something. I replied, I don't trust myself to speak without breaking. He ran a hand through his hair and said, you're punishing me. I looked up and said, I'm protecting myself. He scoffed. You're being cold, he said. I nodded. I learned from you. We argued in circles. It meant nothing, he said. It meant everything, I answered. You're stuck in your head, he said. Because you put me there, I replied. He raised his voice. I said I was sorry. I said that wasn't enough. He slammed his hand on the counter and said, what do you want from me? I said, the truth, without excuses. He pulled out his phone and said, I'll share my location. He sounded proud, like he was handing me peace. I stared at him and said, that's not trust. He frowned and said, it should make you feel better. I shook my head. Love shouldn't come with tracking. He said, you're impossible. I replied, you're avoiding responsibility. Later, when he left for work, the house felt too quiet. I walked into the bathroom and froze. A long blonde strand lay near the sink. I picked it up and whispered, that's not mine. My chest tightened. My thoughts spiraled fast and loud. I replayed every word he'd said. Every promise. Every lie. When Evan came back, I held up the strand and said, explain this. He barely glanced at it. It's nothing, he said. You're paranoid. That word hit hard. Don't call me that, I said. He rolled his eyes. You're looking for problems. I asked, why am I finding things that don't belong to me? He laughed softly and said, you're imagining things. I felt myself shake. I'm not crazy, I said. He stepped closer and said, you're acting like it. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I stepped back and said, gaslighting me won't save you. He went silent. I called Maya. The moment she heard my voice, she said, what did he do now? I said, he brought flowers. She snorted. Of course he did. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, Lena, this isn't love. I whispered, then why does it hurt so much? She said, because you stayed too long. I swallowed and said, he shared his location. Maya laughed, sharp and bitter. That's not romance. That's damage control. I closed my eyes and said, I feel like I'm losing my mind. She replied, you're finding it. That night, Evan said, you're still mad? I looked at him and said, I'm awake. He asked, can we move on? I said, I don't know where forward is anymore. He turned away, annoyed. I stayed still, finally understanding that love should feel safe, not watched, not doubted, and never begged for through flowers left on a table. I sat on my bed with my laptop open and said, I just need another opinion. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Maybe I am wrong, I whispered. I typed everything out, shaking, rereading, deleting, then posting. When replies started pouring in, my stomach dropped. One comment said, you're insecure. Another said, stop invading his privacy. I stared and said, I'm not crazy. My chest burned anyway. I scrolled and read, men do this all the time. I whispered, that doesn't make it okay. Someone wrote, you should be grateful he didn't cheat. I laughed quietly and said, he tried. Another comment said, "You sound controlling." I closed my eyes and said, "I just wanted honesty." My throat tightened as more people mocked me. "Grow up," one wrote. "Get therapy," another added. I slammed the laptop shut and said, "Why did I think strangers would be kind?" My reflection in the dark screen looked small. Am I really that easy to dismiss? I asked the room. My phone buzzed. Maya's name flashed. "Did you post?" she asked. I said, "Yes." She sighed and said, "Tell me everything." She came over an hour later and said, "Look at me." I did. "You're not crazy," she said. Tears spilled. I said, "They called me insecure." She scoffed. "Of course they did." I wiped my face and said, "What if they're right?" Maya crossed her arms and said, "Then answer this." Her voice hardened. "Why are you more scared of being alone than being betrayed?" I opened my mouth but nothing came out. She pressed, "Seriously, Lena." I swallowed and said, "Because I don't know who I am without him." Maya nodded once. "That's the problem." I snapped, "So I'm the problem?" She shook her head. "No. The situation is." She leaned closer. "But you're choosing familiarity over self-respect." I stood and paced. "He says I'm overreacting." Maya laughed. "Men say that when consequences knock." I stopped and said, "He shared his location." Maya stared. "And?" I said, "He thinks it proves trust." She replied, "Trust isn't GPS." Her words landed hard. I whispered, "I feel stupid." Maya said, "You were loyal." I said, "I stayed." She said, "You survived." I shook my head. "I still love him." She answered, "That doesn't mean you stay." Silence filled the room. My chest hurt differently now. Maya grabbed my hands and said, "If a stranger told you this story, what would you tell her?" I didn't hesitate. "I'd tell her to leave." Maya nodded. "Then listen to yourself." I whispered, "I don't want to be alone." She said, "You already are. He just lives there." Those words cracked something open. I sat down slowly and said, "I think I've been protecting him more than me." Maya smiled sadly. "Now you're hearing yourself." I looked at my closed laptop and said, "I don't trust my denial anymore." Maya squeezed my hand and said, "Good. That's how waking up feels." I took a breath and said, "What if leaving ruins everything?" Maya replied, "Staying already is." I rubbed my arms and said, "He keeps saying he loves me." She answered, "Love without respect is noise." I whispered, "I'm tired." Maya said, "Then stop carrying his lies." I nodded, feeling heavy but clearer. I opened the laptop again and said, "I hate that I asked them." Maya shrugged. "You were looking for permission." I admitted, "I wanted someone to tell me I was wrong." She said, "Now tell yourself the truth." I swallowed and said, "He crossed a line." Maya replied, "Several." My phone buzzed with a new comment. I read it out loud. "You're dramatic." Maya rolled her eyes. "Drama is hiding escorts, not reacting." I exhaled and said, "I think I knew before posting." She smiled softly. "Denial delays clarity." I stared at the wall and said, "I'm scared of starting over." Maya said, "You're scared of ending a lie." I felt tears again, different this time. "I deserve peace," I said. She nodded. "Say it again." I repeated, "I deserve peace." The words stuck. I sat quieter, steadier, and felt denial loosen its grip. I finally understood my pain was trying to protect me. I sat in the clinic chair and said, "I just need the test." Dr. Harris nodded and said, "We'll take good care of you." His voice was calm. I asked, "How long for results?" He replied, "A few days." I said, "Okay," like I wasn't terrified. He wrapped the band around my arm and said, "Deep breath." I watched the wall and said, "I trusted him." Dr. Harris said, "You trusted someone you loved." I whispered, "I feel stupid." He shook his head and said, "You're human." After, I sat in my car and stared at my phone. 5 years, I said out loud. I replayed holidays, fights, apologies, and nights I told myself I was imagining things. I said, I kept shrinking. No one answered. My silence felt heavy. When I got home, Evan was on the couch with a drink. He said, "Where were you?" I replied, "Out." He scoffed and said, "You didn't have to disappear." I looked at him and said, "I didn't disappear." I stopped explaining. He laughed and took another sip. Days passed quietly. Evan missed work. "I'm sick," he said. I replied, "Call your boss." He said, "You don't care anymore." I answered, "I'm tired." He drank more. Bottles clinked. "You're judging me," he said. I said, "I'm watching." One night he stumbled and said, "You're supposed to help me." I crossed my arms and said, "I helped for years." He snapped, "So now you're perfect?" I said, "No. I'm done bleeding for you." That shut him up. I waited for my results. Every buzz made my heart jump. I said, "Please." Evan paced and said, "You're punishing me." I replied, "I'm protecting myself." He said, "This is killing me." I answered, "It already killed something in me." Dr. Harris called and said, "Your results are clear." I exhaled and said, "Thank you." He added, "Take care of yourself." I whispered, "I will." I sat on the bed and cried quietly, not from fear, but relief. Evan came home drunk and said, "So you're fine?" I said, "Physically." He frowned. "What does that mean?" I replied, "You broke my trust, not my body." He slammed his fist and said, "You're cold." I said, "I learned it here." He missed another shift. His boss called. He shouted. I listened. His life felt loud and messy. Mine felt quiet. I realized rock bottom isn't chaos. It's silence after you stop saving someone who won't save themselves. I sat still and felt power in distance. I made coffee and Evan said, "Why are you so calm?" I answered, "Because I stopped chasing." He laughed and said, "You think you're better now?" I said, "No. I'm clearer." He muttered, "You're giving up." I replied, "I gave enough." He dropped into a chair and said, "I need you." I said, "You need control." He scoffed. "You're cruel," he said. I looked at him and said, "Cruel would be lying to you like you lied to me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. That afternoon Dr. Harris called again to check in. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I said, "I'm quiet." He replied, "Quiet can be strength." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I'm learning," I said. Evan watched me pack a small bag. "Where are you going?" he asked. I said, "Nowhere far." He said, "You're leaving." I answered, "I'm breathing." He slammed the door and shouted, "You're ruining us." I whispered, "You already did." That night he cried. "I'll stop drinking," he said. I replied, "I hope you do." He asked, "Will you stay?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know." He begged, "Please." I answered, "Please isn't change." I lay awake listening to him pace. I didn't follow. I didn't fix. I didn't soften. In the quiet, I felt something solid inside me. Rock bottom wasn't falling. It was standing still and finally letting go. The morning light came and Evan slept on the floor. He said, "Are you still mad?" I answered, "I'm still here." He said, "That's not fair." I replied, "Neither was cheating." He turned away. I felt steady. I checked my phone, breathed, and sat in silence. For the first time, his chaos didn't pull me under. I felt distant, grounded, and awake. Rock bottom stayed quiet, and I chose not to fill it with his noise anymore. I told myself, "This is mine." I didn't smile, but I didn't panic. I let the quiet stay. I let him unravel without me. That was the power. That was the beginning. I sat, breathing evenly, understanding that silence was no longer emptiness, but space where I could finally stand alone without collapsing. I stayed still, listening to myself, and realized this quiet was strength. At last. Evan watched me from the doorway and said, "You're different." I kept folding clothes and replied, "I'm quieter." He stepped closer and said, "That's worse." I looked at him and said, "For you." His face tightened. "Are you leaving?" he asked. I shrugged. "I'm thinking." That made his voice shake. He sat down hard and said, "I'll go to therapy." I nodded once. "Okay." He rushed, "I'll stop drinking." I said, "You should." He added, "We can get married." I finally looked at him and said, "Do you hear yourself?" He blinked. "What?" I answered, "You're listing ways to keep me, not ways to fix you." He stood and paced. "I'm scared," he said. I replied, "You should be." He said, "I'm losing you." I folded another shirt and said, "You lost me when lying felt easier than telling the truth." He dropped to his knees and said, "Please don't do this." I felt nothing move inside me. He cried. Real tears this time. "I can change," he said. I asked, "Why now?" He said, "Because I can't live without you." I replied, "That's not accountability. That's fear." He covered his face and said, "You're being cruel." I said, "I'm being honest." He promised schedules, meetings, boundaries. I listened and realized every plan started with me staying. None started with him facing consequences alone. I said, "You never once said you were wrong." He looked up and whispered, "I said I'm sorry." I answered, "Sorry isn't the same as responsibility." He grabbed my hands and said, "I need you." I gently pulled away and said, "I needed you too." Silence filled the space. My chest didn't ache like before. It felt steady. That scared him. "Why aren't you crying?" he asked. I replied, "Because I already did." I lay in bed that night and imagined mornings without tension. I imagined choosing what I wanted without checking his mood first. My heart didn't race. It settled. "I think I'm okay," I whispered to myself. I didn't panic. I breathed. The next day he followed me room to room. "Say something," he begged. I said, "I'm listening to myself." He snapped, "You're shutting me out." I replied, "I'm letting myself in." He scoffed. "So I'm the villain now?" I shook my head. "You're the lesson." He said, "After everything we've been through?" I answered, "That's why this hurts." He said, 5 years means nothing to you?" I looked at him and said, "It meant everything. That's why I stopped begging." He stared like I'd slapped him. He tried one more time. "I'll do couples therapy." I said, "I don't want to fix this relationship." He whispered, "You're giving up." I replied, "I'm growing." My voice felt strong, unfamiliar, and mine. He cried again. "I don't know who I am without you." I said, "That's something you need to learn." He asked, "What about me?" I answered, "I chose you for years. Now I choose me." The words felt real. I started sleeping deeper. Eating more. Laughing softly at nothing. Evan noticed. "You're happier," he said bitterly. I replied, "I'm lighter." He said, "You replaced me already." I shook my head. I replaced fear. One morning he said, "If I change, will you stay?" I answered, "Change isn't a bargain." He went quiet. I realized I wasn't waiting for proof anymore. I already knew. I stood by the door later and said, "I'm going out." He asked, "With who?" I smiled slightly and said, "Myself." He didn't respond. I stepped outside and felt air fill my lungs. I realized begging had stopped somewhere between pain and clarity. I didn't announce it. I didn't decide it. It just ended. I was no longer asking to be chosen. I was choosing. For the first time, imagining a future without Evan didn't terrify me. It felt open. Quiet. Mine. I packed quietly while the house slept and said nothing out loud. Evan watched from the doorway and asked, "So you're really doing this?" I folded a shirt and said, yes. He laughed once and said, you're dramatic. I zipped my bag and replied, I'm calm. That seemed to scare him more than tears ever did. He blocked the door and said, we need to talk. I nodded. We already did. He raised his voice. You can't just leave. I said, I already did in my head. He stepped back like I'd pushed him. After everything? He asked. I answered, that's why. He ran a hand through his hair and said, you didn't even fight. I said, I fought for years. He snapped, you're quitting. I replied, I'm choosing peace. He laughed, sharp and bitter. You think life will be easier without me? I met his eyes and said, I think it will be quieter. There was a knock at the door. Evan froze. Who's that? He asked. I said, Jake. Evan opened it and said, why are you here? Jake looked between us and said, you missed work again. Evan scoffed. So now you're spying? Jake said, no. I'm checking on you. I watched Evan's face tighten. Jake glanced at my bag and said, you okay? I answered, I will be. Evan snapped, don't talk to her. Jake frowned. She's leaving, man. Evan turned red. She's confused. Jake shook his head. She looks clear to me. Silence followed. Evan shouted, you're all against me. Jake sighed. No one's against you. You're fighting yourself. Evan laughed. You think you're better? Jake replied, I think you messed up. Evan turned to me. Say something. I said, he's right. That broke him. You're choosing him? Evan asked. I shook my head. I'm choosing me. He slammed his fist into the wall. I gave you everything. I said, you gave me anxiety. He stared like he didn't recognize me. Jake stepped closer to Evan and said, let her go. Evan yelled, stay out of it. Jake replied, I can't watch you destroy everything. Evan looked at me, eyes wild. You'll regret this. I answered, I regret staying. He dropped onto the couch and covered his face. I lost control, he said. I nodded. You did. He whispered, I don't know who I am now. I said, that's not my job anymore. My voice didn't shake. That silence was final. Jake picked up my bag and said, I'll walk you out. Evan looked up. You're leaving like this? I said, this is the only way. He asked, no goodbye? I replied, this is it. I stepped toward the door. Evan said, if you walk out, don't come back. I paused and said, I wasn't planning to. Jake opened the door. Cold air hit my face. Evan called my name once. I didn't turn. The door closed behind me with a soft click. I stood still for a moment. Jake asked, you good? I exhaled and said, I am now. He nodded. You did the right thing. I said, it hurts less than staying. He smiled sadly. That's how you know. I walked down the steps without looking back. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. I got into the car and sat quietly. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't burn. I felt space where panic used to live. Jake leaned in and said, text me if you need help moving the rest. I nodded. Thank you. He said, for what it's worth, you were never the problem. I smiled faintly. I know that now. I drove away slowly, watching the house shrink in the mirror until it disappeared. The road stretched open. I whispered, I'm free. The word didn't scare me. It grounded me. Leaving didn't feel like failure. It felt like truth. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't look back. I kept driving, breathing evenly, finally choosing a life where love didn't hurt more than leaving. Months passed, and I said to myself, I'm still standing. I unpacked boxes in a quiet apartment and spoke out loud just to hear my own voice. This is mine, I said. No one argued. The silence felt clean. I rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, without rushing myself or checking anyone else's reaction. Maya visited and said, "You look different." I smiled and said, "I feel lighter." She laughed. "That's what peace looks like." I made coffee and replied, "I didn't know quiet could feel this loud." She nodded. "That's your nervous system learning safety." I liked that explanation. People talked. Evan's name came up without me asking. A coworker said, "Did you hear about him?" I answered, "No," they said, "he got written up." I shrugged. "That's unfortunate." They looked surprised. I realized I meant it. I didn't feel anything sharp. Jake texted once. "You okay?" he asked. I replied, "I am." He said, "He's not doing great." I paused, then typed, "I hope he figures it out." That was true. I didn't add more. Distance had taught me restraint. I ran into Evan at the grocery store. He looked smaller. "Hey," he said. I replied, "Hi." He asked, "You look good." I said, "I feel good." He shifted. "Life's been rough." I nodded. I heard. He waited for sympathy. I offered none. He said, "I miss you." I answered, "I don't miss who I was." That silence told me everything. He asked, "Can we talk sometime?" I said, "I don't think that helps either of us." He frowned. "You're cold." I replied, "I'm healed." I walked away. That night I told myself, you didn't owe him anything. I cooked dinner and played music I liked. I laughed at a stupid show. My phone buzzed with his name. I muted it. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. Weeks later, someone sent me a screenshot. Evan posted about sobriety, then deleted it. People commented. People speculated. I closed the app. "Not my story," I said. It felt good to mean it. Maya asked, "Do you feel bad?" I considered it. "I feel sad for him," I said. "But I feel free for me." She smiled. "That's called boundaries." I nodded. "They're new." She laughed. "They suit you." I moved my body more. I ate better. I slept deeply. I caught myself smiling in mirrors. "Who are you?" I asked my reflection. I answered, "Someone who listens." That felt powerful. Another message came. Evan wrote, "I'm changing." I stared at it and said, "Change doesn't need witnesses." I didn't respond. I blocked the number. My hands were steady. At work, my boss said, "You seem focused." I said, "I finally am." She nodded. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I smiled. I plan to. One afternoon, Jake ran into me downtown. "You look solid," he said. I laughed. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me." He shrugged. "It's true." He added, "He's blaming everyone." I replied, "That sounds exhausting." Jake nodded. "I wish he'd take responsibility." I said, "He will, or he won't." I felt neutral. I learned something important then. Justice doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need cheering. It unfolds quietly when patterns meet consequences. I didn't have to push. I just had to step aside. I wrote in a notebook and said, "Distance isn't punishment. It's protection." The words settled. I read them again. I believed them. I ran into an old neighbor who asked, "Are you happier?" I answered, "I'm calmer." She smiled. "That lasts longer." I thought so too. On a rainy night, I sat by my window and whispered, "I forgive myself." That mattered more than anything else. I didn't forgive Evan yet. I didn't need to. I wasn't angry. I was done. Months passed, and his life kept being loud without me. Mine stayed steady. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't replay old wounds. I lived forward. I finally understood justice wasn't revenge. It was freedom. It was space. It was choosing not to reach back into a fire just to prove I was burned. I closed my eyes and said, I'm safe. My chest expanded. I let the moment pass without grabbing it. Karma worked quietly. I watched without touching. That was enough. I sat alone and said, I used to think love meant being chosen. I paused and added, now I know it means choosing. My voice didn't shake. I believed myself. Maya asked, do you miss him? I answered, I miss the idea I chased. She leaned forward. And now? I said, now I choose peace. She smiled. That sounds permanent. I replied, it finally is. I talk to myself more these days. What do you want? I asked. Safety, I answered. Joy, I added. Respect. No one interrupted. That felt new. At dinner, my mother said, you seem settled. I said, I am. She asked, are you lonely? I shook my head. I'm present. She reached for my hand. That's better. I squeezed back. I know. Jake called once and said, you ever regret leaving? I laughed softly. I regret waiting. He was quiet. That makes sense. I said, I don't need permission anymore. He replied, you never did. I looked back without nostalgia. I said out loud, love shouldn't feel like auditioning. I smiled and continued, it shouldn't beg. The words felt earned, not rehearsed. On a walk, a stranger asked for directions. I helped and kept moving. I noticed how easily I trusted my instincts. You're allowed to take up space, I told myself. I walked taller. I wrote in my notebook, love is consistency. Then I crossed it out and wrote, love is mutual choice. I nodded. That felt right. Maya texted, proud of you. I replied, I'm proud of me too. She sent a heart. I put my phone down without needing more. I passed the old apartment building and whispered, thank you for the lesson. There was no ache. Just clarity. I won't shrink again, I promised. At work, someone joked, you're glowing. I said, I'm grounded. They laughed. Same thing. I agreed. It is. I stopped waiting for messages that never came. I stopped explaining my worth. I said, I choose myself, until it sounded ordinary. That's when I knew it worked. I imagined future love and said, meet me where I stand. I smiled. Or don't. That felt powerful. One quiet night, I said, I am enough, and didn't argue back. My chest felt steady. My breath felt mine. I didn't win by being chosen. I won by walking away and choosing myself. This is where I stand, awake, whole, and done. I met myself every morning and said, what do you need today? I answered, patience. I answered again, honesty. The conversation felt sacred. A friend asked, are you dating? I said, I'm discerning. They teased, that's new. I smiled. So am I. I stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. I told myself, calm can be deep. I repeated it when doubt tried to sound smart. When memories surfaced, I spoke to them. You can pass, I said. They did. I didn't chase closure. I carried it. I stood in front of a mirror and said, I choose partners who choose me back. I nodded. That's non-negotiable. Someone once told me, love is sacrifice. I answered now, love is care. The difference changed everything. I practiced saying no. No, I said kindly. No, I said clearly. The world didn't end. My peace expanded. I listened to my body and asked, are we safe? My shoulders dropped. Yes, I answered. That answer mattered. I thought about the girl I used to be and said, you did your best. I felt compassion replace judgment. At a cafe, I overheard someone begging on the phone. I whispered, I don't do that anymore. I meant it. I learned that choosing myself wasn't selfish. I said, it's responsible. I felt rooted saying it. When doubt visited, I greeted it. You can sit, I said. You don't get to drive. It stayed quiet. I closed the chapter gently and said, I'm not waiting. I smiled. I'm living. I checked my expectations and said, lower them for others, raise them for yourself. I laughed at how true it sounded. A colleague asked, what changed? I said, I stopped negotiating my needs. They nodded like they understood. I let go of timelines. I'm not late, I told myself. I'm aligned. That calmed something old. I honored boredom. I honored rest. I said, these are not failures. When attraction appeared, I asked, is this familiar or safe? The question protected me. I trusted my yes. I trusted my no. I said, both deserve respect. I marked the ending with gratitude. Thank you, I said. Goodbye. I didn't look back. I breathed and said, this is my life. I believed it. I chose it. I stepped forward without fear, without apology, without waiting, carrying dignity, clarity, and a love that begins and ends with me. I claim peace, permanence, wholeness, and my future.